The letter arrived on a quiet afternoon, slipped under the door of a small apartment where the sound of an old piano often filled the air. She noticed it only after finishing her daily practice, her fingers still carrying the warmth of the keys. At first, she thought it was just another bill or advertisement, something ordinary, but the envelope was different, thick, cream-colored, with a seal pressed carefully at the back. She picked it up slowly, almost afraid to open it, as if the moment itself might disappear if she rushed. Inside was an invitation. Not just any invitation, but one that made her read the words twice, then again just to be sure she wasn't misunderstanding. She had been invited to perform at a royal cultural evening. For a moment, she simply stood there, the letter trembling slightly in her hand. The room around her felt smaller, quieter. The old piano behind her, scratched and worn from years of use, suddenly seemed like it belonged to another world. She had never imagined something like this. Not really. Her life had always been simple. She learned music not from famous teachers or expensive schools, but from long hours alone, guided by old recordings and memories of someone who once believed in her. Every note she played carried pieces of her past. Late nights, quiet struggles, and moments when she almost gave up but didn't. And now, somehow, she had been noticed. The days that followed moved both quickly and slowly at the same time. She kept reading the letter, making sure it was real. It described the event as one of the most prestigious gatherings in the country, attended by respected figures, artists, and members of high society. It also mentioned one name that made her pause every time she saw it. A royal critic. He was known everywhere, not just for his position but for his sharp words. People said he could decide the future of a performer with just a few sentences. Some admired him for his honesty. Others feared him. She had seen recordings of his reviews before. Calm, controlled, but often cold. He didn't hide disappointment. He didn't soften his opinions. And he certainly didn't encourage those he believed were not worthy. The thought of playing in front of him made her chest feel tight. Still, she didn't decline. She couldn't. This was more than just an opportunity. It was something she had worked toward without even knowing it. So she prepared. Every day she practiced longer than before. She paid attention to every detail. Timing, emotion, expression. But no matter how much she practiced, a quiet voice in her mind kept asking the same question. Would it be enough? The night before the event, she barely slept. She sat by the piano, not playing, just looking at the keys. Her reflection in the dark surface of the instrument looked uncertain, almost like she was seeing someone else. She thought about all the times she had played without anyone watching. Back when music was just something personal, something safe. Now it felt different. Now it felt like everything depended on it. The day of the event arrived with a kind of silence that made everything feel heavier. She dressed carefully, choosing something simple but neat. Nothing too bright, nothing too bold. She didn't want attention for the wrong reasons. The venue was larger than she expected. As she approached, she could see the lights shining across the entrance, the tall doors, and the people arriving in elegant clothes. Conversations filled the air, soft but confident. Everyone seemed to belong there, except her. She stepped inside, trying not to draw attention. The floors were polished, reflecting the light above. The walls were decorated with art she didn't recognize but knew must be important. Everything about the place spoke of history, status, and expectations. Her name was checked at the entrance, and she was guided inside with polite gestures, but no real warmth. It wasn't unkind, just distant. She found a quiet corner and held onto the program sheet she had been given. Her performance was listed among others, placed somewhere in the middle of the evening. That gave her time. Time to wait. Time to think. She watched as people moved around, greeting each other with familiarity. Some laughed softly, others spoke in low, serious tones. There was a certain confidence in the way they carried themselves, like they had done this many times before. She felt like an outsider stepping into a world that wasn't built for her. At one point, her eyes drifted toward the front of the hall. That's when she saw him, the royal critic. He sat in a place that made it clear he was important. His posture was straight, his expression calm but unreadable. People approached him with respect, speaking carefully, as if every word mattered. He listened, nodded occasionally, but rarely smiled. Even from a distance, there was something about him that made her feel small. She quickly looked away. Her hands felt cold, so she clasped them together, trying to steady herself. She reminded herself why she was there. Not for him, not for anyone else, for the music. Still, the pressure didn't go away. As the event began, the room slowly settled. Performances started one by one. Some were met with polite applause, others with more enthusiasm. Each performer walked onto the stage with confidence, something she wished she had more of at that moment. She watched carefully, learning from each one, but also feeling the weight of her own upcoming turn. Time moved closer. Her name would be called soon. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. In that small pause, she imagined the piano back in her room. The quiet, the familiar sound, the feeling of being alone with the music. It helped, just a little. When she opened her eyes again, the room felt less overwhelming, though not by much. A voice from the stage announced the next performer. It was her. For a second, everything seemed to slow down. The sounds around her faded, and all she could hear was the steady beating of her own heart. She stood up carefully, smoothing her outfit without even realizing it. Each step toward the stage felt heavier than the last, as if the floor itself was testing her. As she reached the edge of the stage, she paused briefly. The lights were brighter than she expected. The audience stretched out before her, faces watching, waiting, some curious, some uninterested. And then, without meaning to, her eyes found him again. The critic. He was looking directly at her now. Not with curiosity, not with encouragement, but with something else. Something colder. Something that made her grip tighten slightly as she walked toward the piano. She sat down slowly, adjusting her position. The bench felt unfamiliar. The piano, though beautiful, didn't feel like hers. For a moment, her fingers hovered above the keys. This was it. Everything had led to this moment. She took one more breath, trying to steady the storm inside her. The room was silent, waiting, and just before her fingers touched the keys, she felt the full weight of every expectation, every doubt, every quiet fear she had carried with her. But she didn't move away. She stayed, right there at the piano, ready to begin. Her fingers finally touched the keys, but the first note did not come right away. For a brief second, she just sat there, listening to the silence around her. Felt louder than any sound. She knew everyone was watching, waiting for something impressive, something perfect. She gently pressed the first key. The note echoed softly across the hall. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was clear, real. She followed with the next, then another, slowly building the melody she had practiced so many times before. At first, her hands felt stiff. The piano was different from the one she knew so well. The keys were smoother, lighter. Took a moment to adjust. But she kept going, focusing on each note, trying to find her rhythm. A few people in the audience leaned forward slightly, giving her their attention. Others remained relaxed, watching without much interest. She could feel their presence, even without looking directly at them. Then, from the front of the hall, a quiet voice broke through the music. It wasn't loud, but it carried. A predictable start. Her fingers hesitated for just a fraction of a second. She didn't need to look to know who had spoken. The critic. A few people nearby let out small, uncomfortable laughs. Not because it was funny, but because they didn't know how else to react. The comment hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. She tried to ignore it. She kept playing. But something had shifted. Her confidence, which was already fragile, felt like it had been pushed slightly out of place. The notes were still correct, the timing still steady, but the feeling behind them began to slip. Another quiet comment came, this time a bit more direct. Safe. Too safe. This time more people reacted. A few exchanged glances. Someone whispered something to the person next to them. The room was no longer fully focused on her music. It was focused on judgment. Her chest tightened. She had known this could happen. She had prepared for it in her mind, telling herself she would stay calm, stay focused. But thinking about it and living it were two very different things. Her hands started to feel colder again. She tried to bring herself back, to remember why she chose this piece, why it mattered to her. But the critic's voice, even when silent, seemed to linger. She pressed the keys harder than before, trying to bring more strength into the sound. For a moment it worked. The music grew fuller, more confident. A few heads in the audience lifted again, paying closer attention. Felt like she might regain control of the moment. But then came another interruption. A soft clap, slow, unimpressed, came from the same direction. Trying harder doesn't make it deeper. This time, the reaction in the room was clearer. A few people shifted in their seats. Some looked at her with a kind of sympathy, others with doubt. The energy had changed completely. Her heart began to race. She missed a note. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but to her it felt like a loud mistake. It broke her concentration just enough to make everything feel uncertain again. She corrected herself quickly and continued, but now her thoughts were no longer steady. They moved too fast, filled with questions and fear. Was he right? Was she really just playing it safe? Was she not good enough for this place? The music continued, but it no longer felt like hers. It felt like something she was trying to hold together, rather than something flowing naturally. Another sound rose from the audience. This time it wasn't a comment. It was a quiet boo. Just one voice at first, but it was enough. It shocked her more than anything else. She had expected criticism. She had prepared herself for harsh words. But this felt different. Felt personal. Her fingers slowed. For a second she thought about stopping. The idea came suddenly, almost like a way out. If she stopped now, she wouldn't have to face whatever came next. She could leave the stage, disappear into the background, and avoid the weight of the moment. Her hands hovered above the keys again. The music faded into silence. The room didn't react right away. It was as if everyone was waiting to see what she would do. Her eyes lowered to the piano. She could feel the heat rising to her face, the embarrassment settling in. This was exactly what she had feared. Not just failing, but failing in front of people who expected it. In front of someone who seemed to be waiting for it. She took a slow breath. It wasn't steady, but it was enough to keep her from completely losing control. She thought about the long hours she had spent practicing. The nights when no one was there to hear her. When she played not for approval, but because she loved it. That feeling felt far away now, but not gone. Another breath. She became aware of the silence again. Not just the absence of music, but the presence of judgment. Eyes on her. Waiting. Some curious. Some critical. Some already deciding. She lifted her hands slightly, then lowered them again without playing. Something inside her felt stuck, like she was standing at a crossroads, but couldn't see the path clearly. From the front, the critic shifted in his seat. He didn't say anything this time, but his expression was enough. Calm. Unmoved. Almost bored. It hurt more than the words. For a moment, she looked up. Not at the whole audience, just in his direction. Their eyes met briefly. There was no encouragement there. No sign that he believed she could recover. Just quiet judgment. She looked away quickly. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys again. She knew she couldn't continue the same way. Not after everything that had just happened. The piece she had chosen no longer felt right for this moment. It felt distant, disconnected from what she was feeling now. She needed something else. Something real. Something that came from deeper than practice or preparation. But what? Her mind searched, moving through memories, through melodies she had played before. Nothing seemed to fit. Nothing felt strong enough to break through the tension in the room. Then, slowly, something began to surface. Not from her practice. Not from the pieces she had prepared. But from something older. A memory. A sound she had heard long ago. Carried in a way that stayed with her even when she didn't realize it. Her fingers pressed one key. A single note. Different from before. Softer. But filled with intention. The room reacted, not with noise, but with attention. It was subtle but noticeable. Something had changed. She followed with another note, then another. This wasn't part of her original plan. This was something else. Her breathing steadied slightly as she continued. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. A quiet determination. She wasn't sure where this would lead. She didn't know how the audience would react. But for the first time since stepping onto the stage, she wasn't thinking about them. She was thinking about the music again, and this time it felt like it belonged to her. The new note lingered in the air a little longer than expected. It was soft, almost fragile, but it carried something the earlier performance had lost. It wasn't about showing skill anymore. It was about feeling. She let her fingers move slowly, building the melody step by step, as if she was finding her way in the dark. Each note came with more confidence than the last, not because she was certain of the outcome, but because she had stopped trying to impress. The room grew quieter. Not the tense silence from before, but something different. People were no longer whispering. No one laughed. Even the small movements in the audience seemed to slow down, as if everyone was waiting to understand what she was doing. She didn't look up this time. Her focus stayed on the piano, on the sound beneath her fingers. The fear was still there, sitting somewhere deep inside, but it was no longer controlling her. It had softened, replaced by something steadier. She played another sequence, slightly stronger now. The melody began to take shape, not from memory alone, but from instinct. It reminded her of something familiar, something she had once heard, not in a concert hall, but in a quiet room long ago. The thought came gently, like a distant echo. She didn't fully understand it yet, but she followed it anyway. Her hands moved with more ease now. The stiffness from earlier was gone. The notes flowed more naturally, connecting in a way that felt honest. In the audience, a few people shifted forward in their seats. Their expressions had changed. The doubt was still there for some, but curiosity had replaced the earlier judgment. This was no longer the same performance. Near the front, the critic remained still. At first, his expression didn't change. He watched her the same way he had before, with a calm, controlled look. But something in the music began to reach him, even if he didn't show it right away. She continued playing, letting the melody grow. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it carried emotion, a quiet strength. Another sequence followed, deeper this time. And then it happened, a subtle shift. The melody she was building started to resemble something known. Not obvious yet, not clear enough to recognize fully, but familiar. A few people in the audience glanced at each other, as if trying to place it. She didn't rush. She let the notes unfold slowly, carefully, giving them space to breathe. Her mind was no longer filled with doubt. It was focused, calm in a way she hadn't felt since before stepping onto the stage. She wasn't thinking about the critic now or the earlier comments or even the audience. She was following the music. The memory guiding her became clearer. It wasn't just any melody. It was the anthem, but not in the usual way. Not the way it was typically performed at formal events. This was different. Carried a softer tone, almost like a personal version of it. A style that wasn't widely heard anymore. She had come across it years ago in an old recording. The voice behind it had been gentle but powerful, filled with emotion rather than strict form. She didn't know why that memory came to her now, but it felt right. Her fingers moved with more certainty as she leaned into that style, shaping each note with care. The anthem slowly revealed itself, but in a way that felt new, almost intimate. The audience began to realize it too. You could see it in their faces. Recognition, surprise. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the silence of doubt. It was the silence of attention, of people truly listening. Near the front, something shifted. The critic's posture changed slightly. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. His eyes, which had seemed distant before, focused more closely now. There was a flicker of something in them. Not approval, not yet, but interest. She continued, unaware of the exact effect she was having. For her, it was simple. She was playing what she felt. The melody grew a little stronger, carrying more emotion with each passing moment. It wasn't perfect in the technical sense, but it didn't need to be. It was real. And that made all the difference. A few members of the audience leaned forward even more. Some held their breath without realizing it. Others closed their eyes briefly, letting the music reach them in a deeper way. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The earlier tension, the whispers, the quiet boos, they felt distant now, like something that had happened a long time ago. This moment belonged to something else. She played a softer section, letting the notes fall gently, like a quiet reflection. It gave the melody space, a pause that made everything feel more meaningful. Her hands no longer trembled. They moved with purpose. And then, as she reached the next part of the anthem, she added something subtle. A slight variation. A touch that wasn't written in the standard version. But it was familiar. Very familiar. At least to one person in the room. The critic's expression changed again. This time it was clearer. His calm, controlled look broke for just a second. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment, but in recognition. He knew this, not from recent performances, not from common versions, but from something older, something personal. He sat a little straighter. The room around him faded into the background as he listened more closely. She continued, unaware of the exact impact of that small change. But she could feel something shifting. The energy in the room was different now. Stronger, warmer. Her confidence grew with each note. Not because she was trying to prove anything anymore, but because she had found something real to hold on to. The melody rose gently, carrying emotion rather than force. It filled the space without overwhelming it. And then came another variation. Again subtle, but intentional. It wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a message, not spoken but felt. The critic leaned forward slightly. His hands, which had been resting still, now clasped together. His eyes didn't leave the stage. For the first time that evening, he wasn't observing. He was listening, truly listening. She reached the final part of the section and slowed down, letting the notes stretch just a little longer. It created a sense of anticipation, a quiet moment before what would come next. The room was completely still. No whispers, no movement, just the sound of the piano. She took a soft breath, barely noticeable, and prepared to continue. What started as a moment of uncertainty had turned into something unexpected, something deeper, and without fully realizing it, she had begun to change not just her own path in that moment, but the entire mood of the room. The pause she created did not feel empty, felt full, like something important was about to happen. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, and for a moment, she simply listened to the silence she had shaped. No one in the room moved. Even the smallest sound seemed to disappear, as if the hall itself was holding its breath. Then she continued. The next notes came softer than before, almost like a whisper. But there was a new confidence behind them. She wasn't testing the sound anymore. She was guiding it. The anthem was now clear to everyone. But it didn't sound like the version they were used to hearing at formal events. It wasn't grand or strict. It was gentle, filled with emotion, shaped in a way that felt deeply human. Some in the audience looked surprised. Others seemed drawn in, leaning forward without realizing it. The melody carried a warmth that had not been there earlier in the evening. She let each note settle before moving to the next, giving the music space to speak on its own. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't forced. It was honest. As she played, something inside her felt lighter. The fear that had once held her back was still there, but it no longer had control. It had been replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She was simply sharing something real. Near the front, the critic remained still, but his expression had changed more than before. His eyes were no longer distant. They were focused, almost searching. The variations she had introduced earlier were becoming clearer now. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, a style that wasn't commonly heard. It belonged to someone whose influence had once been strong, but had slowly faded from public performances. As she continued, the connection grew stronger. The way she shaped certain notes, The slight pauses, the gentle rise and fall of the melody. It all pointed to a specific style, one that carried both discipline and deep emotion. The critic's hands tightened slightly. He recognized it now, not as a general influence, but as something very specific, very personal. He leaned forward, almost without realizing it. Around him, others remained quiet, still absorbed in the performance. They could feel the emotion, even if they didn't fully understand where it was coming from. But for him, it was different. This was not just music. This was memory. She reached a section where the melody softened even more. Her fingers moved slowly, carefully, as if she was handling something fragile. The sound carried across the room, reaching every corner. There was no need for volume. The emotion was enough. In that moment, something shifted inside the critic. A memory surfaced, clear and unexpected. A quiet room from years ago. A piano not as grand as the one in front of him now. A familiar presence beside it. The way the music had once filled that space, not perfectly but with meaning. He blinked, bringing himself back to the present. But the feeling stayed. On stage, she continued without hesitation. She wasn't aware of the exact memory she had touched, but she could feel the change in the room. It gave her more strength, more clarity. She leaned slightly into the next part, allowing the melody to grow again, but not in a loud way. It was a steady rise, controlled and thoughtful. Each note felt intentional. Each pause felt necessary. The audience was fully engaged now. No one whispered. No one shifted in their seat. Even those who had seemed uninterested earlier were now watching closely, their expressions serious, almost thoughtful. The performance had moved beyond skill. It had become something else. Something that connected. She reached another variation, one that required more control. Her fingers moved with precision, but without tension. It felt natural now, like she had found her place within the music. The anthem in this form felt alive. Not just a piece to be performed, but a story being told. And she was telling it in her own way. The critic's gaze did not move. His earlier judgment, his dismissive attitude, all of it had faded into the background. What remained was something quieter, more reflective. He wasn't comparing anymore. He wasn't analyzing in the same way. He was remembering. Another phrase came, and with it, another subtle detail that confirmed what he had begun to realize. This style, it wasn't just similar. It was deeply connected to someone he knew. Someone whose music had once shaped his understanding of what true expression sounded like. His breathing slowed. For the first time that evening, he seemed unsure, not of the performer, but of his own earlier reaction. On stage, she moved into the next section with calm confidence. The fear that had once made her hesitate was gone. In its place was something stronger. Trust. Not in the audience. Not in the critic. But in herself. She let the melody unfold naturally, without forcing it into something it wasn't. The result was simple but powerful. It reached people in a way that technical perfection often couldn't. A soft shift in the rhythm added depth, drawing the listeners even closer. Created a feeling that was hard to describe, but easy to feel. The kind that stays with you. As she played, her expression remained calm, focused. She wasn't looking for approval. She wasn't searching for reactions. She was present, fully. The room seemed smaller now, not because it had changed, but because the distance between her and the audience had disappeared. They were no longer separate. They were part of the same moment. The critic slowly leaned back in his seat, but his eyes remained fixed on the stage. His earlier confidence, the certainty in his judgment, had shifted into something more complex. He was listening in a different way now, not as someone deciding a result, but as someone experiencing something he hadn't expected. The melody approached another quiet section, and she softened her touch again. The notes felt almost like a conversation, gentle and honest. There was no need for anything more. The power was already there, in the silence between the notes, in the emotion carried within them, and in the unexpected connection that had formed. She continued, unaware that her choice, her instinct, had done more than just change her performance. It had reached someone who rarely allowed himself to be moved. And that, without her knowing it, was beginning to change everything. The melody carried forward like a quiet wave, steady and full of meaning. She did not rush it. Each note had space to breathe, and that space made everything feel deeper. It was no longer just a performance. It felt like something personal being shared with the entire room. Her fingers moved with calm control. There was no sign of the hesitation from earlier. No trace of the moment when she almost stopped. That version of her felt far away now, like it belonged to someone else. The audience could feel it too. The change was clear. People who had once leaned back in their seats were now sitting upright. Some had their hands folded, resting still in their laps. Others held onto the edge of their chairs, not even realizing it. No one wanted to break the moment. The anthem continued, but it was not being played in a way they had heard before. It carried emotion in every note, as if it was telling a story instead of following a fixed pattern. A few older members in the audience exchanged quiet glances. There was recognition in their eyes, not just of the melody, but of the way it was being expressed. It reminded them of something they had not heard in a long time. On stage, she remained focused, unaware of how deeply her music was reaching. She was not thinking about the past anymore. She was not thinking about the critic or the earlier reactions. She was simply playing. And that made it real. Her hands moved into the next section, where the melody grew slightly stronger. It was not loud, but it carried a sense of quiet strength, like a voice that did not need to shout to be heard. The sound filled the hall, reaching every corner without effort. Near the front, the critic sat completely still. But his stillness was no longer cold. It was thoughtful. His expression had softened, though only slightly. The sharpness that once defined his gaze had been replaced with something more reflective. His eyes followed her hands, then returned to her face, then back to the keys. He was no longer watching for mistakes. He was listening for meaning. Another variation came, and this one was clearer than before. Carried a signature style, a way of shaping the melody that belonged to someone specific. The critic's breath caught, almost silently. There was no doubt now. He knew exactly where he had heard this before. Not in a public performance. Not in a concert hall. But in a private space long ago. The memory came back stronger this time. A quiet evening. A piano placed near a window. The same anthem, but played with care, with feeling, not for an audience, but for the simple joy of music. He remembered sitting nearby, listening without saying much. The sound had stayed with him, even when the moment itself had passed. And now, somehow, that same feeling was here again. On this stage. Through someone he had never met. He leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting together, no longer relaxed, but attentive. The room around him faded. The music held his focus completely. On stage, she continued, unaware of the exact memory she had awakened. But she could feel the connection in the room. It gave her strength. The melody softened again, moving into a quieter passage. Her fingers pressed the keys with a gentle touch, creating a sound that felt almost like a whisper shared with each person present. The audience remained still. No movement, no sound. Even breathing seemed quieter. It was the kind of silence that only happens when people are truly listening. Her expression remained calm, but there was something new in it now. A quiet confidence. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that comes from knowing you are doing something honestly. She was no longer trying to prove herself. She was simply being herself. The music reflected that. It flowed naturally, without force, without hesitation. And that made it powerful. Another small shift in the melody brought a deeper tone, one that carried more emotion. It felt like the story within the music was reaching an important point. The critic's eyes did not move. His earlier judgment, his quick words, his dismissive attitude, they felt distant now. In their place was something quieter, something more human. He blinked slowly, as if trying to hold onto the moment without breaking it. The connection was undeniable. This was not just skill. This was understanding. She reached a section that required careful balance. The The notes were close together, the timing precise, but she played them with ease, as if they belonged exactly where they were. There was no tension in her hands, no fear, only focus. The audience responded without making a sound. Their attention was complete. A few faces showed emotion clearly now. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, but present. A softened expression. A slight change in the eyes. The kind of reaction that cannot be forced. The kind that happens naturally. The melody began to build again, slowly, gently rising towards something more complete. It was not a sudden change, but a steady one, like a story reaching its final chapters. Each note felt meaningful. Each pause felt intentional. She allowed the sound to grow but never pushed it too far. She kept control, guiding it carefully. The room followed her. Every person present was now part of the same moment. The earlier tension had completely disappeared. In its place was something rare, a shared feeling. The critic's posture straightened slightly. His expression, though still controlled, carried a clear shift. There was respect there now, not spoken, not announced, but present. He listened to every detail, every small variation, recognizing the depth behind it. This was not a performance meant to impress. It was a performance that revealed something, and that made it unforgettable. On stage, she moved into the final section of the anthem. Her hands slowed just slightly, giving each note more weight, more meaning. The melody felt complete, but not rushed. She let it unfold naturally, allowing the emotion to carry through until the very end. The final notes approached, soft but steady. The room remained still. No one moved. No one spoke. They were waiting, not for a mistake, not for a judgment, but for the end of something that had already changed them in a quiet way. Her fingers pressed the last keys gently. The sound lingered in the air, fading slowly. She did not move right away. She let the silence return. But this silence was different. It was full of what had just been shared. And for a brief moment, the entire room stayed exactly as it was, still, listening, feeling, before anything else could happen next. The final note faded slowly, almost like it didn't want to leave the room. For a few seconds, nothing happened. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire hall was holding onto the last moment of the music, unsure of what to do next. She kept her hands resting lightly on the keys. Her eyes stayed lowered, not out of fear this time, but because she was still inside the feeling of what she had just played. The silence stretched. It was not uncomfortable. It was full. Then, somewhere in the audience, a single clap broke through. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was clear. Came from the front, from the critic. The sound seemed to travel across the room, reaching every corner. People turned slightly, surprised not by the clap itself, but by who had started it. He did not rush. His hands came together again, slow and steady, not as a performance, but as a genuine response. For the first time that evening, his expression had completely changed. There was no sign of dismissal, no cold distance, only quiet respect. The audience followed. One by one, more claps joined in. The sound grew, not suddenly but naturally. It spread across the hall, building into something strong and warm. It was no longer polite applause. It was real. She lifted her head slowly, unsure at first of what she was hearing. The sound reached her gently, then more clearly. It filled the space around her, replacing the earlier tension with something entirely different. Her eyes moved across the room. The same faces that had once held doubt now showed something else. Appreciation, surprise, even admiration. She hadn't expected this. Not after how things had started. She stood up carefully from the piano, her movements calm but slightly uncertain, as if she was still adjusting to the change. The applause continued. Some people stood. Not all at once, but enough to be noticed. The energy in the room had shifted completely. Near the front, the critic rose from his seat. That alone drew attention. People watched closely, curious about what he would do next. He did not speak right away. He simply stood there for a moment, looking at her, as if choosing his words carefully. The applause slowly softened, not because it ended, but because people were waiting for him. He took a small step forward. His posture remained composed, but there was something different in the way he carried himself now. Less rigid, more human. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but it carried clearly across the hall. "This evening," he began, pausing briefly, "I was quick to judge." The honesty in his words surprised many. He continued, his tone steady, without trying to defend himself. "I saw what I expected to see, and I said what I expected to say." There was no discomfort in his voice, just truth. "But what followed," he added, looking directly at her, "was something I did not expect." The room remained silent, listening closely. He took another breath, as if allowing the moment to settle. "You chose not to leave, not to respond with anger, not to prove anything in the way most would." His eyes softened slightly. "You chose to play with meaning." A quiet murmur moved through the audience, not loud, but present. He continued, his voice carrying a deeper tone now. "The way you played the anthem." He paused again, just for a second. "It was not just skill, it was understanding." He did not elaborate further, but the weight of his words was clear. "And that," he said gently, "is far more rare." The room responded with another wave of applause, stronger this time, more confident. She stood still, taking in what he had said. There was no need for more words. What mattered had already been spoken. The critic stepped back slightly, returning to his place, but he did not sit immediately. He remained standing for a moment longer, his gaze still on her, not as a judge, but as someone who had learned something. Eventually, the applause began to settle again. She gave a small, respectful nod, not overly dramatic, just simple and sincere. Then she turned slightly, stepping away from the piano. Each step felt lighter than the one before. The weight she had carried onto the stage was gone. In its place was something new, not pride in the loud sense, but quiet confidence, the kind that comes from facing something difficult and not walking away. As she moved off the stage, a few people near the sides offered small gestures of acknowledgement. A nod, a soft smile. Nothing overwhelming, but enough to be felt. She didn't stop. She didn't try to hold onto the attention. She simply walked back into the space she had entered earlier, but everything felt different now. The room had not changed, but her place in it had. She found a quiet corner again, just as she had before the performance. But this time she was not trying to hide. She was simply taking a moment to breathe. Her hands rested at her sides, no longer cold. Her heart, though still beating a little fast, felt steady. Across the room, conversations slowly began again, but the tone had shifted. There was more warmth now, more openness. A few people glanced in her direction, not with doubt, but with interest. Some even moved slightly closer, as if considering approaching her. Near the front, the critic finally sat down again. But he was not the same as before. His posture remained composed, but his expression carried a quiet thoughtfulness. For the first time that evening, he did not speak. He simply sat and listened as the event continued. But it was clear his attention was no longer on judging the next performance. His mind was somewhere else. Back in the moment that had just passed. Back in the music that had reached him in a way he had not expected. Back in a memory that had been brought to life again. On the other side of the room, she stood quietly, not seeking attention, not replaying every moment in her mind. She just stood there, present, calm, and for the first time in a long while certain of one thing. She belonged. Not because someone had said it, not because she had proven anything to anyone, but because she had stayed true to something real when it mattered most. The event continued, but for many in that room, the evening had already reached its most important moment. Not in the grand performances, not in the formal speeches, but in a quiet shift that had taken place between doubt and understanding, between judgment and respect. And as the night moved forward, one thing remained clear. What had started as a moment of dismissal had turned into something no one would forget. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real.